Peter the Hermit's departure for the East did not mark the end of crusading fervor in Germany. He left behind his follower Gottschalk to raise another army, and many other preachers and leaders stepped forward to follow in his footsteps. German people responded to the call in their thousands, but unlike the French, they were not in such a rush to set off. For the Holy Land, they believed there was unfinished business to take care of closer to home. Jewish communities had existed for centuries along the trade routes of Western Europe. These communities were largely made up of Sephardic Jews, descendants of those who had spread out from the Mediterranean during the Dark Ages. They maintained strong ties with fellow Jews in Byzantium and the Islamic world, allowing them to play a major role in international trade, especially in commerce between Christian and Muslim lands, because lending money with interest usury was banned in the Christian West and strictly limited in Byzantium. Jews filled a crucial economic role by running money-lending businesses across Christian Europe. Their long traditions of learning and technical skill also gave them an edge in medicine, making them valued physicians, despite having no formal civil rights. The Jews had largely avoided serious persecution in Western Europe, like in ancient Visigothic Spain, where they had once suffered. Both secular and religious authorities generally protected them because of their usefulness. The kings of France and Germany were known for offering their support, and the archbishops of the major Rhineland cities treated them favorably. However, tensions were growing. As Western Europe slowly shifted from a system of feudal services to a cash-based economy, peasants and poorer townsfolk increasingly relied on borrowing money, often from Jewish lenders. As their debts mounted, so did their resentment. Meanwhile, Jews, lacking legal protection, charged high interest rates and made substantial profits, especially when they enjoyed the protection of local rulers. By the 11th century, their unpopularity was steadily increasing. As more social classes became borrowers, the rise of the crusading movement only made things worse. Preparing for a crusade was expensive. Knights who lacked land or wealth often had to borrow money from Jews to afford the journey. But many began to question, was it right to go fight for Christ only to be financially bound to the very people who had crucified him? Poorer crusaders, many already in debt to Jewish lenders, also questioned whether it was just to be hindered in their holy mission by those seen as enemies of Christ. Crusade preachers focused intensely on Jerusalem, though. Sight of the crucifixion, and naturally, attention turned to the people believed to have been responsible. The Muslims might be today's enemy, but in the eyes of many, the Jews were worse. They had crucified Christ himself. Even during the wars in Spain, there had already been signs that Christian armies might mistreat Jewish communities. Around the time of the expedition to Barbastro, Pope Alexander II felt compelled to remind the Spanish bishops that there was a clear distinction between Muslims and Jews. The Muslims were irreconcilable enemies of the Christians, he wrote, while the Jews were willing to live and work peacefully among them. Still, in Spain, the Jews had long enjoyed the favor of Muslim rulers. The Christian conquerors found it hard to fully trust them. In December 1095, the Jewish communities of northern France sent warnings to their fellow Jews in Germany, alerting them that the rising crusading movement might bring danger to their people. There were even rumors of a massacre of Jews in Rouen, although this massacre probably never happened. The fear was real, and Peter the Hermit was quick to seize the opportunity. Hinting that he might not be able to keep his followers in check, he managed to persuade the Jews of France to give him letters of introduction to other Jewish communities across Europe, asking them to welcome him and provide his army with food and supplies. Around this same time, Godfrey of Bouillon, the Duke of Lower Lorraine, began preparing for his own crusade. A rumor spread through the region that he had vowed to avenge the death of Christ by shedding Jewish blood. Terrified, the Jewish communities of the Rhineland asked Colonymos, the chief rabbi of Mainz, to write to Godfrey's overlord emperor, Henry IV, who had consistently shown friendship toward the Jews. The letter pleaded with him to prevent any violence. At the same time, the Jewish communities of Mainz and Cologne, hoping to protect themselves, each offered Godfrey a sum of 500 silver coins. Emperor Henry responded by instructing his leading nobles and clergy to ensure the safety of all Jews under their jurisdiction. Godfrey, having already gained what he wanted from the Jewish payments, replied that he had no intention of persecuting them and was happy to give the assurances they had requested, if the Jews had hoped they could escape Christian fanaticism. With just a few payments and promises, they were quickly proven wrong. At the end of April 1096, a man named Volkmar, about whom little is known, set out from the Rhineland with over 10,000 followers to join Peter the Hermit in the east. He traveled through Bohemia along the route to Hungary. Just days later, Peter's former disciple Gottschalk departed with a slightly larger group, taking the same route Peter had used up the Rhine and through Bavaria. Meanwhile, a third force was being gathered by a minor noble from the Rhineland, named Count Emich of Leisingen, already notorious for his lawlessness and banditry. Emich now claimed that a miraculous cross had been branded onto his flesh. As a battle-hardened soldier, he attracted a more diverse and dangerous group of recruits than the more religiously driven Volkmar or Gottschalk. Alongside the usual mix of passionate but untrained pilgrims, some of whom bizarrely followed a goose they believed was guided by God. Emich's army included members of the French and German nobility. These included the lords of Zweibrücken, Salm and Wernenberger, Hartmann of Dillingen, Wago of Nessel, Clarenbald of Venduel, Thomas of Lafer, and William, Viscount of Melun, known as the Carpenter for his enormous strength. Asterisk, perhaps, inspired by the success of Peter the Hermit and Duke. Godfrey, in using crusading zeal for personal gain, Emich saw an opportunity to do the same. Ignoring Emperor Henry's orders to protect the Jews, he convinced his followers to begin their so-called crusade on the 3rd of May with an attack on the Jewish community in Speyer, near his home. The assault was not particularly successful. The Bishop of Speyer, who had been persuaded by a generous gift, placed the Jews under his protection. Only 12 were captured and killed by the Crusaders after they refused to convert to Christianity. One Jewish woman took her own life to avoid rape. The bishop managed to save the rest of the community and even arrested some of the murderers, having their hands cut off as punishment. Yet, small as the massacre in Speyer had been, it set a terrible precedent. On the 18th of May, Emich's army arrived. In Worms, soon after, a rumor spread that the Jews had kidnapped a Christian, drowned him, and used the water to poison the town's wells. The Jews were already unpopular in Worms and the surrounding countryside, and the rumor inflamed the townspeople and peasants. They joined Emich's troops in attacking the Jewish quarter. Every Jew they could find was killed. It's in Speyer. The bishop tried to intervene, opening his palace to shelter the Jews, but Emich and the enraged mob forced their way in, ignoring the bishop's pleas. They slaughtered all the Jews who had taken refuge there, about 500 people in total. The massacre in Worms took place on the 20th of May, 5 days later. On the 25th of May, Count Emich arrived at the gates of Mainz, one of the most important cities in the region. He found them closed by order of Archbishop Rothhard. However, the mere news of his approach triggered anti-Jewish riots within the city, during which a Christian was killed. The next day, the 26th of May, some of Emich's sympathizers inside the city opened the gates for him. The Jewish community, which had gathered at the synagogue, tried to buy protection. They sent gifts of 200 silver marks to the archbishop, and the city's chief noble begging to be given shelter in their palaces. At the same time, a Jewish envoy went to Emich and paid him 7 pounds of gold in exchange for a promise to spare them. But the money was wasted. The very next day, Emich launched an attack on the archbishop's palace. Rothhard, alarmed by the rage of the crowd, fled with his entire household. With him gone, Emich's followers stormed the palace. The Jews tried to defend themselves, but were quickly overwhelmed and killed. The lay protector, whose name has not survived, may have shown more courage. But Emich set fire to his palace, forcing the people inside to evacuate. Several Jews saved themselves by converting to Christianity, but those who refused were killed. The massacre continued for 2 more days as the Crusaders hunted down any remaining Jews. Some of those who had initially converted were overcome with guilt and committed suicide. One man, before taking his own life and killing his family, burned down the synagogue to prevent it from being desecrated, the chief rabbi of Mainz. Kalonymos had escaped with about 50 others to the town of Rudesheim. There, they sought asylum from Archbishop Rothard, who was staying at his country estate nearby. Seeing their fear, Rothard saw an opportunity to attempt their conversion. But for Kalonymos, this was too much. In a fit of desperation, he grabbed a knife and attacked the archbishop. He was quickly overpowered, but the assault sealed the fate of the group. All of them were put to death. In total, around 1,000 Jews were killed in the massacre at Mainz. Emich then moved on toward Cologne. Anti-Jewish violence had already broken out there in April, and now, terrified by the horrors at Mainz, the Jewish community scattered. Many hid in nearby villages or in the homes of Christian friends. Over the weekend of Pentecost, the 1st to the 2nd of June, while Emich was nearby, their Christian hosts helped conceal them, although the synagogue was burned and one Jewish man and one woman, who refused to convert, were killed. The Archbishop of Cologne managed to prevent any wider violence. At Cologne, Emich decided that his campaign in the Rhineland was complete. In early June, he left with most of his army, heading up the main river toward Hungary. However, a large group of his followers believed that the Moselle Valley also needed to be cleansed of Jews. They broke off from Emich's army at Mainz and reached the city of Trier on the 1st of June. Most of the Jewish population there found refuge in the archbishop's palace. But some, overcome with panic, began fighting among themselves. Others threw themselves into the Moselle River and drowned. The attackers then moved on to Metz, where 22 Jews were killed. Around mid-June, they returned to Cologne, hoping to catch up with Emich, but when they found he had already departed, they made their way down the Rhine. And from the 24th to the 27th of June, carried out massacres in the towns of Neuss, Wevelinghafen, Eller, and Xanten. After that, the group dispersed. Some returned to their homes, while others likely joined the forces of Godfrey of Bouillon. Meanwhile, news of Emich's brutal campaign had reached the groups that had already left Germany for the east. Volkmar and his followers arrived in Prague at the end of May. On the 30th of June, they began massacring the Jewish population there. The local authorities were powerless to stop them, and even the strong protests of Bishop Cosmas were ignored. From Prague, Volkmar continued into Hungary. At Nitra, the first major town across the border, he probably tried to do the same thing. But the Hungarians would not allow such violence. When the Crusaders continued to behave with wild lawlessness, the Hungarian forces attacked and scattered them. Many were killed or captured. What became of the survivors or of Volkmar himself is unknown. Gottschalk and his band, who had followed the same route Peter the Hermit once took through Bavaria, paused at Regensburg-Ratisbon to slaughter the Jewish community there. A few days later, they crossed into Hungary at Moson, then known as Wieselburg. King Koloman allowed them to buy food and supplies as long as they behaved themselves. But from the beginning, they plundered the countryside, stealing wine, grain, sheep, and cattle. The local peasants resisted. Fighting broke out. Several people were killed, and one young Hungarian boy was gruesomely impaled by the Crusaders. King Koloman responded quickly. He sent troops to confront the Crusaders and surrounded them in the village of Stuhl-Weissenberg, farther to the east. The Crusaders were forced to surrender their weapons and all the goods they had stolen. But the tension continued. Perhaps they tried to resist again, or perhaps Koloman, having learned of the chaos at Nitra, simply no longer trusted them, even disarmed. Whatever the case, as the Crusaders lay helpless, the Hungarian army launched a brutal assault. Fled first, but was soon caught. None of his followers survived. A few weeks later, Emich's army reached the Hungarian border. It was larger and more dangerous than Gottschalk's force, and King Koloman, still shaken by recent events, was deeply concerned. When Emich sent a request for safe passage through Hungary, Koloman refused and dispatched troops to guard the bridge crossing a branch of the Danube, near Wieselburg. But Emich was not easily deterred. For 6 weeks, his forces clashed with the Hungarians in a series of small battles in front of the bridge, while working to construct another bridge of their own. During that time, they also plundered the countryside on their side of the river. Eventually, the Crusaders succeeded in crossing the river using their makeshift bridge and laid siege to the fortress of Weisselberg itself. They were well armed and had siege engines powerful enough to make the fall of the town seem inevitable. However, panic suddenly gripped the Crusaders, likely caused by rumors that King Suleiman was approaching with his full army. In the confusion, the defenders of Weisselberg launched a surprise attack on the disorganized Crusader camp. Emich was unable to rally his troops. The battle was brief but devastating. Most of his men were killed on the spot. Emich and a handful of knights escaped thanks to their swift horses. Emich eventually returned home with his surviving German followers. The French knights who had joined him, Clarembald of Vendule, Thomas of Lafer, Got, and William the Carpenter, decided to continue their journey by joining other expeditions heading toward Palestine. The failure of Emich's crusade. Soon after, the defeats of Volkmar and Gottschalk made a deep impression across Western Christendom. Many devout Christians saw these disasters as divine punishment for the Crusaders, massacres of the Jews. Others who had always doubted the wisdom of the crusading movement took them as proof that God disapproved of the whole venture. So far, nothing had happened that seemed to justify the cry that had echoed at Clermont. Deus vult. God wills it. ***, the Western princes who had taken the cross were far more patient than Peter the Hermit and his followers. Were willing to follow the Pope's schedule. Before they could depart, they needed time to gather and equip their armies, raise the necessary funds, and make arrangements for governing their territories during what might be a years-long absence. None of them planned to leave before the end of August. The first nobleman to set out was Hugh, Count of Vermandois, known as Lemaine the Younger. Some Latin chroniclers later mistranslated this as Magnus, meaning the Great, which was a poor fit. Hugh was the younger son of King Henry I of France and Anne of Kiev, a princess of Scandinavian descent. Around 40 years old, Hugh was a man of noble rank but limited wealth. He had gained his modest county by marrying its heiress and had never played a major role in French politics. He took pride in his royal blood, but he was not an effective leader. His motivations for joining the crusade remain unclear. Perhaps he had inherited a spirit of adventure from his Viking ancestors. Maybe he hoped that in the East he could gain the power and riches more suited to someone of his birth. It's also likely that his brother, King Philip of France, encouraged him to go in hopes of earning favor with the Pope, leaving his lands in the care of his wife, Countess Adelaide. Hugh departed for Italy in late August, accompanied by an army of his vassals and several knights from King Philip's domains. Before he left, he sent a messenger ahead to Constantinople to request that the Byzantine emperor prepare a welcome worthy of a prince of royal blood. As Hugh traveled south, he was joined by several knights returning from Count Emich's failed expeditioning, among them Drogo of Nessa, Clarembald of Vendule, and William the Carpenter. Hugh and his companions passed through Rome and reached Bori. In early October, in southern Italy, they found the Norman princes also preparing for the crusade. Bohemond's nephew, William, decided not to wait for his family and chose instead to cross the Adriatic Sea with Hugh from Bari. Hugh sent a delegation of 24 knights led by William the Carpenter across the sea to Dyrrhachium Modern, Dors in Albania. Their task was to notify the Byzantine governor of Hugh's arrival and to repeat Hugh's demand for a grand reception. The governor, John Comnenus, was thus able to alert Emperor Alexius and begin making preparations to receive the distinguished guest. However, Hugh's actual arrival was far less grand than expected. A storm battered the small fleet he had hired for the crossing. Some ships sank with all passengers lost. Hugh himself was shipwrecked and washed ashore near Cape Palene, a few miles north of Dyrrhachium. John's representatives found him there disheveled and disoriented and brought him to the city. Governor John provided Hugh with new clothes, food, and hospitality, treating him with honor but keeping him under close watch, while Hugh was delighted by the attention. Some of his companions suspected he was being held more as a prisoner than a guest. Hugh stayed in Dyrrhachium until Admiral Manuel Butamites, a high-ranking imperial official, arrived to escort him to Constantinople. The journey was comfortable, though the route was intentionally indirect. Passing through Philippopolis, modern Plavd, as the emperor wanted to prevent Hugh from coming into contact with the Italian pilgrims traveling along the Via Egnatia. When Hugh finally reached Constantinople, Emperor Alexius welcomed him warmly, showered him with gifts, and honored him but still kept his movements restricted. Hugh's arrival prompted Alexius to formalize his strategy toward the Western Crusade. Leaders. Based on his intelligence and his memory of the renegade Frankish general Roussel of Bouillon, Alexius suspected that the Crusaders' true goal was not just Jerusalem, but to carve out territories for themselves in the east. He didn't oppose this ambition as long as the Byzantine Empire recovered the lands it had lost to the Turks. In fact, Alexius saw an advantage in having new Christian buffer states along the empire's frontiers. At that time, the idea of independent small states was inconceivable. Any such territories would be expected to owe allegiance to a greater power. So Alexius decided to require a formal oath of loyalty from each Western leader, ensuring that their future conquests would be recognized as under his suzerainty. To gain their cooperation, he was ready to offer lavish gifts and financial support. By showcasing his wealth and imperial grandeur, he hoped they would not feel humiliated by swearing fealty. Hugh, thoroughly impressed by the emperor's generosity and magnificence, agreed readily. But the next Western leader to arrive would prove far more difficult to convince. Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, is remembered in later legends as the ideal Christian knight, the flawless hero of the entire crusade. But a closer look at the historical record presents a more nuanced picture. Born around 1060, Godfrey was the second son of Count Eustace II of Bouillon and Ida, daughter of Duke Godfrey II of Lower Lorraine. Through his mother, he was descended from Charlemagne. Though he had been named heir to his maternal family's lands, Emperor Henry IV seized the duchy after his grandfather's death. Godfrey, with only the county of Antwerp and the lordship of Bouillon in the Ardennes. However, Godfrey remained loyal to Henry IV, serving him in his campaigns in Germany and Italy. As a reward, the emperor granted him the title of Duke of Lower Lorraine in 1082, but only as a temporary office, not a hereditary title. Lorraine was deeply influenced by the Cluniac reform movement, which promoted papal authority. Godfrey remained formally loyal to the emperor. The growing influence of Cluniac ideals may have left him conflicted. Godfrey's rule in Lorraine was not especially effective, and there were doubts about whether the emperor would continue to trust him. With the post, disheartened about his political future, troubled by questions of religious loyalty, and stirred by genuine spiritual zeal, Godfrey responded to Pope Urban's call for the crusade. He took his preparations seriously. After raising money by pressuring Jewish communities, he sold his estates at Rosy and Stenay along the Meuse River and mortgaged his castle at Bouillon to the Bishop of Liege. With these funds, he raised a sizable army. His past title and the strength of his forces gave him considerable prestige, which was further enhanced by his courteous nature and striking appearance. He was tall, strong and fair-haired with a golden beard, the very image of a northern knight. Despite all this, he was a rather average military leader, and his presence was often overshadowed by his younger brother, Baldwin. Both of Godfrey's brothers had also taken the cross. The eldest, Eustace III, Count of Bouillon, was a reluctant crusader who longed to return to his wealthy estates in France and England. He sent fewer troops than Godfrey and let him take the lead. Eustace likely traveled separately, possibly through Italy. Baldwin, the youngest, was of a very different character. Originally intended for the church, he had received a fine education at the cathedral school in Reims and retained a love for learning. But the church didn't suit his temperament, so he left religious life and joined his brother in Lorraine as a layman. Baldwin and Godfrey made an interesting contrast. Baldwin was taller with dark hair and pale skin, while Godfrey was fair. Godfrey was warm and approachable. Baldwin was proud and reserved. Godfrey lived simply. Baldwin, though capable of enduring hardship, preferred extravagance and display. Godfrey was known for his chastity. Baldwin for his lustful pursuits, Baldwin enthusiastically embraced the crusade. With few prospects at home, he saw in the east the possibility of power and territory. He brought his Norman wife Godfrey of Tosny and their young children, making it clear that he had no intention of returning. Godfrey and his brothers were joined by many prominent knights from the Walloon and Lotharingian regions. Among them were their cousin Baldwin of Rethel, Lord of Labourg, Baldwin II, Count of Hainault, Raymond, Count of Toul, Warner of Grey, Dudo of Consarberg, Baldwin of Stavelot, Peter of Stenay, the brothers Henry and Geoffrey of S, perhaps. Because he felt uneasy about his loyalty to the Holy Roman Emperor while preparing for a crusade endorsed by the Pope, Godfrey chose not to take the same route through Italy that the other crusade leaders planned to follow. Instead, he opted to go through Hungary. According to a growing legend in the West, his supposed ancestor, Charlemagne, had taken that very route on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Godfrey departed from Lorraine at the end of August. After several weeks marching along the Rhine and down the Danube, he reached the Hungarian frontier near the Lethe River in early October. From there, he sent an embassy led by Geoffrey of S, who had prior experience with the Hungarian court, to request permission from King Coloman to pass through his lands. King Coloman, still wary after the recent disasters caused by previous Crusader armies, was not eager to receive more. He kept the delegation waiting for 8 days before agreeing to meet Godfrey at Odenburg. Godfrey arrived there with a small party of knights and was welcomed to spend a few days at court. The impression he made during this visit was favorable, enough that Coloman agreed to allow the army through Hungary, but only on one condition: Baldwin, whom he suspected to be the most dangerous figure in the group, had to stay behind as a hostage, along with his wife and children. When Godfrey returned to camp, Baldwin initially refused to be taken hostage, but eventually he agreed, and the army was allowed to cross into Hungary at Odenburg. Coloman promised to supply them with provisions at fair prices, while Godfrey issued a strict warning to his troops. Any act of violence would be punished by death. Thanks to these precautions, the Crusaders passed peacefully through Hungary, with King Coloman and his troops monitoring them closely the entire way. After a brief stop of 3 days to resupply at Mangelos near the Byzantine frontier, Godfrey reached Semlin toward the end of November. From there, the army crossed the Sava River in an orderly fashion and entered Belgrade. Once the crossing was complete, the hostages Baldwin and his family were safely returned. The imperial authorities, likely warned in advance by the Hungarians, were well prepared for Godfrey's arrival. Belgrade itself had been abandoned, since Peter the Hermit's forces had looted it 5 months earlier. However, a frontier guard quickly traveled to the city of Niš, where the local governor Nicetas was staying. There, an escort for Godfrey had already been assembled. The escort departed immediately and met Godfrey's army in the forests of Serbia. Roughly halfway between Niš and Belgrade, provisions for the army had been arranged in advance, and the march through the Balkan Peninsula proceeded without incident. When they reached Philippopolis, word arrived that Hugh of Vermandois had reached Constantinople and had been lavishly welcomed with generous gifts. So impressed were Baldwin of Hainault and Henry of S by this news that they decided to race ahead of the main force to the capital in hopes of receiving similar rewards before the rest of the army arrived. But rumors also circulated, not entirely without merit, that Hugh was being held as a prisoner. Godfrey was troubled by this news. Around the 12th of December, Godfrey's army reached the town of Salimbria, located along the Sea of Marmara. Until that point, his troops had maintained excellent discipline. But something changed there. The next 8 days, they began pillaging the surrounding countryside. The cause of this breakdown in discipline is unclear, though Godfrey later attempted to justify it as retaliation for Hugh's supposed imprisonment. Emperor Alexius I quickly responded by sending 2 Frenchmen in his service, Rodolphe Piedelot and Roger, son of Dagobert, to speak with Godfrey and urge him to restore order and continue his march peacefully. Their mission was successful. On the 23rd of December, Godfrey's army arrived at Constantinople and set up camp. At the emperor's request, Outside the city near the upper reaches of the Golden Horn, Godfrey's arrival posed a serious dilemma for the Byzantine government. The emperor wanted to ensure Godfrey's loyalty and get him and his men out of Constantinople's vicinity as quickly as possible. While it's uncertain whether Alexius truly believed, as his daughter Anna later suggested, that Godfrey intended to seize the city, he had good reason to be cautious. The suburbs had already been badly damaged by Peter the Hermit's unruly followers, and now an even more dangerous and better armed army had appeared at his gates. But before Godfrey could be moved on, Alexius needed him to swear an oath of allegiance. To that end, the emperor sent Hugh of Vermandois. Far from being mistreated, bore no resentment toward Alexius to Godfrey's camp to convince him to visit the imperial court. Godfrey refused the emperor's invitation. He felt uncertain and uneasy about the situation. Hugh's accommodating attitude towards Alexius confused him, especially since his troops had already spoken with the survivors of Peter the Hermit's disastrous expedition, many of whom blamed their failure on imperial betrayal. Their stories influenced Godfrey's thinking. As Duke of Lower Lorraine, Godfrey had already sworn allegiance to the German emperor, Henry IV. He may have believed that taking an oath to the Eastern emperor would be a conflict of loyalty. In addition, he was reluctant to make any significant commitments until he could consult with the other crusading leaders who he knew would soon arrive. Hugh returned to the palace without delivering a response to Alexius. Alexius was angered by Godfrey's refusal and, in a miscalculated move, tried to pressure him by cutting off the food supplies that had been promised to his army, while Godfrey hesitated on how to respond. His brother Baldwin acted swiftly and began raiding the surrounding suburbs until Alexius agreed to resume the flow of provisions. In an attempt to maintain control, Alexius suggested that Godfrey move his camp further down the Golden Horn to the district of Pira, where the soldiers would be sheltered from the harsh winter winds and easier to monitor under imperial police watch. Both sides backed down for a while. Alexius resumed the food supplies, and Godfrey kept his men in line and maintained discipline. At the end of January, Alexius again invited Godfrey to meet with him. But Godfrey remained unwilling to act alone and continued to wait for the arrival of the other Crusader leaders. Instead of going himself, he sent a delegation his cousin Baldwin of Labourg, along with Conan of Montagu and Geoffrey of Estu, hear the emperor's proposals. But when they returned, Godfrey still declined to give a definite answer. Alexius, wary of provoking open hostilities that might cause another wave of destruction in the suburbs, chose to wait. He ensured that Godfrey's forces were cut off from outside contact and hoped that patience would wear them down. By the end of March, Alexius learned that more Crusader armies were nearing Constantinople. Wanting to resolve the standoff with Godfrey before the situation became more complicated, he once again reduced the Crusaders' supplies, first stopping fodder for their horses, then fish, and finally even bread, just as Holy Week approached. The Crusaders responded by raiding nearby villages for food and supplies. Tensions escalated when they clashed with the Pecheneg troops, Turkic mercenaries who served as local police. In retaliation, Baldwin ambushed a patrol, capturing 60 of them and executing many. Buoyed by this small victory and realizing that peaceful negotiations were now unlikely, Godfrey made the bold decision to act. He ordered his men to burn and loot the houses in Pera, where they had been staying, then led them across a bridge at the head of the Golden Horn. They assembled in formation outside the city walls and began an assault on the gate leading to the palace quarter of Blocherny. Whether Godfrey truly intended to storm the city or merely to pressure Alexius is unclear. But to the Greeks, his actions looked like an attempt to seize the imperial throne. It was Thursday of Holy Week, the 2nd of April, and Constantinople was completely unprepared for the sudden attack. The panic began to spread throughout the city, but it was quickly calmed by the emperor's presence and steady leadership. Alexius was genuinely disturbed that violence had erupted on such a sacred day. Wanting to avoid bloodshed, he ordered his troops to stage a show of force outside the gates without actually engaging the Crusaders. Archers on the city walls were told to shoot their arrows over the Crusaders' heads rather than at them. Crusaders did not press their assault and soon pulled back, having killed only 7 Byzantine soldiers. The next day, Hugh of Vermandois once again went out to reason with Godfrey, but Godfrey mocked him instead, accusing him of being a slave for so readily submitting to the emperor. Later that day, Alexius sent a delegation to propose that Godfrey's troops cross over into Asia Minor even before taking the oath of allegiance. But the Crusaders didn't even wait to hear the message. They immediately launched an attack on the imperial envoys. That was the final straw for Alexius. He ordered more of his troops into battle. The experienced Byzantine soldiers easily routed the Crusaders. After a short clash, Godfrey's forces turned and fled. Defeated, Godfrey finally acknowledged that he had no choice. He agreed to swear allegiance to the emperor and have his army transported across the Bosphorus. The oath ceremony likely took place 2 days later. On Easter Sunday, Godfrey, Baldwin, and their leading nobles pledged to recognize the emperor as overlord of any territory they might conquer and to return to him any land that had once belonged to the empire. In return, they received generous gifts of money and were honored at an imperial banquet. Once the formalities were complete, Godfrey's army was ferried across to Chalcedon and then marched on to camp at Peliconum on the road to Nicomedia. Alexius, meanwhile, had no time to rest. A mixed group of Crusaders, likely Godfrey's vassals who had traveled through Italy under the Count of Toul, had just reached the outskirts of the city. They were camped near Sostenium on the Sea of Marmara. These men were just as unruly, as Godfrey's and wanted to wait for Bohemond and the Norman forces who were close behind, but Alexius was determined not to let them link up with Godfrey before they submitted to imperial authority. Some fighting broke out, but eventually the emperor was able to manage their movements. As soon as Godfrey's army was safely across the Bosphorus, Alexius transported this second group into the capital by ship. There, they joined other Crusaders who had arrived in scattered groups across the Balkans. It took all of Alexius's diplomatic skill and many lavish gifts to convince their leaders to swear the oath of allegiance. When they finally agreed, the emperor arranged for Godfrey and Baldwin to be present, adding weight to the ceremony. Even so, the Western nobles were defiant and disrespectful. One of them even sat down on the emperor's throne. Baldwin sharply rebuked him, reminding him that he had just pledged himself as a vassal to the emperor and should respect local customs. The knight snapped back, saying it was rude for the emperor to sit while so many great warriors were left. Standing, Alexius, overhearing the comment and having it translated, calmly asked to speak with him. When the knight began bragging about his undefeated record in single combat, Alexius quietly advised him to try a different approach when facing the Turks. This incident captured the essence of the relationship between the Byzantine emperor and the Frankish Crusaders. The crude knights from the west were clearly impressed by the magnificence of the imperial palace, its refined rituals, and the calm, polished demeanor of the Byzantine court. But at the same time, they resented it. Their pride, bruised by what they saw as condescension, made them act out, often behaving like unruly children. Once the Crusaders had taken their oaths of allegiance, they and their troops were ferried across the Bosphorus to join Godfrey's army on the Asian shore. The emperor had acted just in time, because on the 9th of April, Bohemond of Taranto arrived in Constantinople. At first, the Normans of southern Italy had shown little interest in Pope Urban's call for the Crusade. Their attention was consumed by civil strife following the death of Robert Guiscard. Robert had divorced Bohemond's mother and left his duchy of Apulia to his son by another wife. Siegeld Roger Borsa, Bohemond rebelled and managed to seize control of Taranto and the region of Otranto in the heel of the Italian peninsula. A fragile peace was eventually brokered by their uncle Roger of Sicily. But Bohemond never truly accepted the agreement and quietly continued to undermine his brother. In the summer of 1096, the whole family came together to launch a campaign against the rebellious city of Amalfi. By this time, Pope Urban's crusade proclamations had already reached Italy. Small groups of southern Italians had begun making their way to the east. But it wasn't until the arrival of large, enthusiastic Crusader armies from France that Bohemond recognized the full significance and potential of the movement. He saw that the crusade could be turned to his advantage. Since his uncle Roger of Sicily would never allow him to seize all of Apulia, Bohemond realized he had a better chance of carving out a kingdom for himself in the Levant. The French Crusaders. Religious fervor had already inspired many of the Norman troops gathered outside Amalfi. Bohemond saw an opportunity and embraced it. He declared publicly that he too would take the cross and called on all devout Christians to follow him. In front of his army, he tore his luxurious scarlet cloak into pieces and used it to make crosses. For his officers, his vassals eagerly followed his example, and soon, many of his brothers and uncles' vassals also joined the cause, leaving Roger of Sicily, fuming that the crusade had stripped him of his army, Bohemond's nephew. William set out immediately with the French Crusaders. Bohemond himself, however, needed time to prepare his forces. He entrusted his lands to his brothers, protection, and raised enough funds to support everyone joining him on the expedition. His army set sail from Bari in October. Accompanying Bohemond were his nephew Tancred, William's older brother, the son of his sister, Emma, and the Marquis Odo. His cousins Richard and Rainulf of Salerno, along with Rainulf's son Richard, also joined. The group included Geoffrey, Count of Rossignolo, and his brothers, Robert of Anza, Herman of Canny, Humphrey of Montescabioso, Albert of Cognano, and Bishop Gerard of Ariano, representing the Normans of Sicily. Normans from France also joined him, including Robert of Sourdeval and Bull of Chartres. While Bohemond's army was smaller than Godfrey's, it was well-equipped, experienced, highly disciplined. Bohemond's expedition landed at various points along the coast of Epirus, between Dyrrhachium and Avlona, and regrouped at a village called Dropoli in the Vius River valley. The landing sites were likely chosen in coordination with the Byzantine authorities at Dyrrhachium, who may have wanted to avoid overburdening the towns along the Via Egnatia. However, it seems that Bohemond himself chose the route his army would take. Having campaigned in the region 15 years earlier, he was familiar with the terrain south of the main road and may have hoped that by taking a less traveled path, he could stay out of Byzantine oversight. At the time, Byzantine governor John Comnenus had no spare troops to accompany them, so Bohemond began his march without an imperial escort. Still, relations remained friendly and full supplies were provided to the Normans. Bohemond made it clear to his men that they were in Christian territory and must avoid looting or misconduct. The army crossed the Pindus Mountains, a difficult journey that took them through high mountain passes over 4,000 feet in elevation. They reached Castoria in western Macedonia just before Christmas. The exact route is unclear, but it must have been grueling. When they arrived, Bohemond tried to obtain provisions, but the locals, remembering the Normans' past hostility, were reluctant to share their limited supplies. So the Crusaders seized the cattle they needed, along with horses and donkeys. Many of their original pack animals had likely died in the mountains. They spent Christmas in Castoria, then headed east toward the Vardar River. On the way, they attacked a village of Paulician heretics near their route, burning homes and killing the residents. By mid-February, they reached the Vardar River. Having taken 7 weeks to travel barely more than 100 miles, Bohemond's route likely took him through Edessa, modern Vodena, where he rejoined the Via Egnatia. From there, the emperor assigned an escort of Pecheneg troops to the Crusaders with instructions to prevent looting, stop desertions, and ensure that they didn't linger in any one place for more than 3 days. Vardar, without issue, but the Count of Rossignolo and his brothers stayed behind with a small detachment on the western bank. To push them forward, the Pechenegs attacked. When Tancred heard of the clash, he quickly crossed back over the river and drove off the Pechenegs, capturing a few of them. He brought the prisoners to Bohemond, who questioned them and learned that they were acting under imperial orders. Bohemond then released them, wanting to make it clear that he intended to maintain proper and respectful conduct toward the emperor. From the beginning, Bohemond had made every effort to stay on good terms with the Byzantines. Likely as soon as he landed in Epirus, he sent ambassadors ahead to the emperor. By the time his army had passed Thessalonica and was approaching the road to Sardes, these envoys returned from Constantinople. They brought with them a senior imperial official who quickly established a cordial relationship with Bohemond. Food and supplies were provided generously for the army. And in return, Bohemond not only promised not to attempt to enter any towns along the way, but also agreed to return all the animals his men had taken during the march. While some of his followers were eager to raid the countryside, Bohemond firmly forbade it. The army reached Rauza, modern Keshion in Thrace, on the 1st of April. At that point, Bohemond decided to go ahead to Constantinople himself to learn firsthand what negotiations were taking place between the emperor and the Western leaders who had already arrived. He left his men under the command of Tancred, who led them into a fertile valley off the main road, where they camped and spent the Easter weekend. Bohemond arrived in Constantinople on the 9th of April and was given lodging outside the city walls at the monastery of Saints Cosmas and Damian. The next day he was granted an audience with Emperor Alexius. To Alexius, Bohemond appeared to be by far the most dangerous of the Crusader leaders. The Byzantines had long experience with the Normans and knew them to be formidable enemies, ambitious, cunning, and ruthless. Bohemond had already shown himself to be a strong and effective leader. His troops were disciplined, well-equipped, and completely loyal to him. While he could be overconfident as a strategist, he was also a skilled diplomat and an astute political thinker. His physical presence made a powerful impression. Anna Komnena, the emperor's daughter, who knew him and intensely disliked him, still acknowledged his charisma and praised his appearance. He was exceptionally tall, and though over 40, still had the physique and coloring of a much younger man. Broad shoulders, a narrow waist, fair skin, and rosy cheeks. He kept his yellow-blonde hair short, unlike most Western knights, and was clean-shaven. He had a slight stoop from childhood, but it didn't detract from his air of strength and health. Anna admitted that his expression was hard and his smile unsettling. But like many Greeks, she couldn't help but admire his looks. Alexius first met with Bohemond privately to gauge his intentions. Finding him respectful and cooperative, the emperor later included Godfrey and Baldwin still staying in the palace in the discussions. Bohemond's respectful behavior was carefully calculated. Unlike the other Crusaders, he understood the true power of Byzantium and knew that alienating the emperor would lead to disaster. But if he could win the emperor's trust, he could turn the alliance to his own advantage. Bohemond wanted to lead the crusade, but he had no formal authority from the Pope and would face competition from other Western leaders. However, if he could gain an official appointment from the emperor, he could become the central figure managing both the Crusaders' relationship with Byzantium and the administration of any lands they reconquered for the empire. He would become the linchpin of the entire Christian alliance. Without hesitation, Bohemond swore the oath of allegiance to Alexius and then proposed that he be given the title of Grand Domestic of the East, the commander-in-chief of all Byzantine forces in Asia. Alex found Bohemond's request awkward. He feared and distrusted him, but was eager to keep him on friendly terms. He had already shown Bohemond special honors and generosity and continued to lavish him with money. However, when it came to the request for the title of Grand Domestic, Alexius stalled. He told Bohemond that the time wasn't right for such an appointment, but that if he proved his energy and loyalty, he would surely earn it in the future. Bohemond had to accept this vague promise, which was enough to encourage him to keep cooperating with the emperor for now. Meanwhile, Alexius promised to provide Byzantine troops to accompany the Crusaders. He also agreed to repay their expenses and ensured that their armies were regularly resupplied and kept in contact with each other. Bohemond's army was then summoned to Constantinople. On the 26th of April, it was ferried across the Bosphorus to join Godfrey's forces at Pelicanum. However, Tancred, who neither understood nor approved of his uncle's diplomatic approach, quietly passed through Constantinople by night with his cousin, Richard of Salerno, in order to avoid swearing the oath of allegiance to the emperor. that very same day. Count Raymond of Toulouse arrived in Constantinople and was received by the emperor, Raymond IV. Count of Toulouse, better known by his preferred title Count of Saint-Gelais, was already an older man, probably close to 60. He ruled over one of the wealthiest counties in France and had recently inherited the equally rich region of Provence. Through his marriage to Princess Elvira of Aragon, he was connected to the royal families of Spain, and he had already fought in several religious wars against the Muslim kingdoms of Iberia. Was the only major nobleman with whom Pope Urban had personally discussed the crusade, and he was also the first to declare his commitment to it. Because of this, Raymond felt he had a rightful claim to lead the crusade in a lay capacity. But the Pope, wanting the movement to remain under spiritual leadership, never endorsed this idea. Raymond likely hoped that, as the campaign progressed, a need for a secular leader would emerge naturally. Asterisk from the start. Raymond planned to travel east with the spiritual head of the crusade, Bishop Adhemar of Lapuy. He had taken the cross during the Council of Clermont in November 1095, but it wasn't until the following October that he was ready to depart. He made a vow to spend the rest of his life in the Holy Land, though it's possible that the vow came with conditions. While he placed the administration of his lands in France in the hands of his illegitimate son Bertrand, he carefully avoided formally giving up his rights as ruler. He also brought his wife and his legitimate son Alfonso with him. To fund the expedition, Raymond sold or mortgaged some of his estates, but he seemed relatively cautious in how he equipped his army. His personality is hard to pin down. His actions suggest that he was proud, stubborn, and somewhat greedy. Yet his polite and refined manner impressed the Byzantines, who found him more cultured than most of the other Western leaders. They also considered him more dependable and honest. Anna Komnene later came to view him more favorably due to unfolding events, praised his noble character and moral conduct. Bishop Adhemar, who was clearly a man of deep principle, clearly saw Raymond as a worthy and trustworthy companion. Several noblemen from southern France joined Raymond's crusade. Among them were Rambald, Count of Orange, Gaston of Bern, of Roussillon, William of Montpellier, Raymond of La Forez, and Isord of Gap. Bishop Adhemar of Lapuy brought along his brothers Francis Lambert of Monteil, Lord of Perrins, and William Hugh of Montalong, with all his household men. After Adhemar, the highest-ranking clergyman in the group was William, Bishop of Orange. The Crusader army crossed the Alps via the Canal de Ginevra and made its way through northern Italy to the northern edge of the Adriatic Sea, likely for reasons of cost. Raymond decided not to take the faster sea route across the Adriatic, but instead to march along its eastern coast through Istria and Dalmatia. This turned out to be a poor decision. The roads in Dalmatia were in terrible condition. The local population was hostile. The army made it through Istria without trouble. But then, for 40 winter days, they struggled along the rough, rocky paths of Dalmatia, constantly harassed by wild Slavic tribes attacking from the rear. Raymond personally stayed at the back of the column to protect it. On one occasion, he was only able to save his men by building a makeshift barrier across the road using captured Slav prisoners, whom he had cruelly mutilated. Despite the harshness of the journey, Raymond had prepared well, bringing enough supplies that none of his men starved or died in battle. By the time they reached Skadra, however, food supplies were running dangerously low. Raymond arranged a meeting with the local Serbian prince Bouillon in exchange for expensive gifts. Bouillon agreed to let the Crusaders freely purchase food in the town's markets, but there was no food to be found. So the army had to press on, hungry and exhausted, until it finally reached the Byzantine frontier just north of Dyrrhachium in early February. Raymond and Adhemar hoped their troubles were now over. At Dyrrhachium, the Crusaders were greeted by John Comnenus. Imperial envoys and a Pecheneg military escort were already waiting to guide them along the Via Egnatia. Raymond sent a delegation ahead to Constantinople to inform the emperor of his arrival. And after a few days' rest in Dyrrhachium, the army moved on again. Meanwhile, Adhemar's brother, the Lord of Perrins, stayed behind to recover from an illness. Caused by the harsh journey, Raymond's troops were poorly disciplined and frequently caused trouble. They disliked the presence of the Pecheneg escort, whom they saw as spies or guards watching their every move. Their constant tendency to loot and raid led to repeated clashes with the escort. It didn't take long for things to turn violent. 2 Provencal barons were killed in one such skirmish. Not long afterward, Bishop Adhemar himself wandered off. The road was attacked and captured by the Pechenegs till they realized who he was and quickly released him. Adhemar held no grudge, but the incident shook the morale of the army. Their mood worsened even more when Count Raymond himself was attacked under similar circumstances near Edessa. At Thessalonica, Bishop Adhemar of Lipui left the army to receive proper medical treatment for his wounds. He remained there until his brother, who had stayed behind in Dyrrhachium, could come and join him. Without the bishop's calming influence, the discipline within the army quickly deteriorated. However, there were no major incidents until they reached the town of Rausa in Thrace. Just 2 weeks earlier, Bohemond's men had been warmly welcomed in Rausa. But when Raymond's troops arrived, they apparently took offense, possibly because the townspeople no longer had food to sell, shouting, "Toulouse, Toulouse." Soldiers stormed the town walls, broke inside, and looted every house they could. A few days later, as they approached Rodosto, Raymond's ambassadors returned from Constantinople, accompanied by an imperial envoy. The envoy brought friendly messages from the emperor, urging Raymond to come to the capital quickly, and adding that Bohemond and Godfrey were waiting for him and keen to have him join them. That part of the message and the fear that he might miss out on key negotiations likely convinced Raymond to accept the invitation. He left his army behind and rode on ahead to Constantinople, arriving there on the 21st of April. With Raymond gone, there was no one left to enforce order. The army immediately began raiding the surrounding countryside, but this time their behavior didn't go unchallenged, instead of just a handful of Pecheneg guards. Full regiments of the Byzantine army stationed nearby moved in to stop the looting. In the battle that followed, Raymond's troops were soundly defeated. Many of them abandoned their weapons and baggage and ran. News of this embarrassing defeat reached Raymond. Just as he was on his way to meet with the emperor, Raymond was warmly received when he arrived in Constantinople. He was given a residence just outside the city walls and was urged to come to the palace as soon as possible to take the oath of allegiance to the emperor. But the hardships of his journey, along with the upsetting news of his army's recent defeat, had left him in a foul mood. He was also confused and displeased by what he saw at court. His long-standing ambition was to be acknowledged as the military leader of the entire crusade. Whatever authority he had came from the Pope and his close connection to the papal representative, Bishop Adhemar of Lipui. But the bishop was still absent, and without his presence in council, Raymond was reluctant to make any firm commitments. More importantly, taking the same oath of allegiance that the other crusading leaders had sworn would mean giving up his special position as the Pope's delegate. It would place him on equal footing with the other secular lords, something he didn't want. There was another problem as well. Raymond was smart enough to recognize Bohemond as his chief rival. Bohemond appeared to be enjoying special favor from the emperor, and there were rumors that he might be appointed to a high imperial military command. If Raymond took the oath, he risked not only losing his status, but possibly ending up subordinate to Bohemond, who could be acting as the emperor's official representative. Raymond insisted that he had come to the east to serve God, and that God alone was now his sovereign, clearly implying that he was acting on behalf of the Pope. However, he added that if the emperor himself chose to lead the Christian armies, he would gladly serve under him. This statement showed that it wasn't the emperor he resented, it was Bohemond. The emperor responded that the current condition of the empire wouldn't allow him to leave the capital. Meanwhile, the other crusading leaders became increasingly concerned that Raymond's defiance might jeopardize the entire mission. Bohemond, still hoping to secure the emperor's support and a prominent position in the campaign, even promised that if Raymond openly opposed the emperor, he would stand with the emperor. Godfrey also urged Raymond to reconsider, pointing out how his stubbornness was harming the Christian cause. Alexius stayed out of the arguments, but withheld the generous gifts he had given to the other princes. At last, on the 26th of April, Raymond agreed to take a modified oath. He swore to respect the emperor's life and honor, and to ensure that neither he nor his men would do anything to harm him. This kind of limited oath was common among nobles in southern France, and Alexius found it acceptable. After the negotiations were complete, Bohemond and his army crossed into Asia. Meanwhile, Raymond's army had regrouped at Rodestow, what humbled after their earlier defeat, was waiting for the arrival of Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy, who would lead them on to Constantinople. We have no clear records of what Adhemar did in the capital, but it's likely that he met with senior members of the Greek Church and certainly had an audience with the emperor. These meetings were cordial. He may have helped ease tensions between Raymond and Alexius, because their relationship quickly improved. However, it's more likely that Bohemond's departure played a bigger role. Once Bohemond was gone, the emperor was able to speak to Raymond privately and make it clear that he too distrusted the Normans, and that Bohemond would never be given an imperial command. This reassurance changed things. Raymond crossed the Bosphorus 2 days after swearing his oath, but then returned to the court for another 2 weeks. By the time he left, he was on very good terms with Alexius, and now saw him as a valuable ally against Bohemond. His view of the Byzantine Empire had shifted significantly. Meanwhile, a fourth major crusading army set out from northern France in October 1096. Shortly after Raymond had left his lands, it was led jointly by Robert, Duke of Normandy, his brother-in-law Stephen, Count of Blois, his cousin Robert, II, Count of Flanders. Robert of Normandy was the eldest son of William the Conqueror. He was around 40 years old, mild-tempered, and not particularly effective as a leader. Though he had personal bravery and charm, since his father's death, he had been locked in a half-hearted conflict with his brother, King William Rufus of England, who had repeatedly invaded Normandy. The Pope's call to crusade had moved Robert deeply, and he soon pledged to take part. In return, the Pope arranged a reconciliation between the two brothers while still in northern France. However, it took Robert several months to prepare. He was only able to fund his journey by pledging his duchy to William in exchange for 10,000 silver marks. That deal was formalized in September 1096, a few days later. Robert left for Pontarlier, where he was joined by Stephen of Blois and Robert of Flanderses. In Robert's company were Odo, Bishop of Bayeux, Walter, Count of St. Valery, all the heirs of the Counts of Montgomery and Mortagne, Gerard of Gournay, Hugh of St. Paul, the sons of Hugh of Grantmesnil, and many other knights and foot soldiers, not only from Normandy, but also from England, Scotland, and Brittany. However, the only English nobleman to officially join the crusade was Ralph Guater, Earl of Norfolk, who at the time was living in exile on his mother's estates in Brittany. Stephen of Blois had little personal interest in joining the crusade. However, his wife, Adelaide, daughter of William the Conqueror, was the real authority in their household. It was her decision that he should go, so he went. Accompanying him were his key vassals, Everard of Laputes, Garan Garanat, Caro Assini, Geoffrey Garang, and his chaplain, Alexander. Among the group was also the cleric Fulcher of Chartres, who would later become a noted historian of the crusade. Stephen was one of the wealthiest men in France, and raising the money for the journey was not a challenge for him. He left his estates in the capable hands of his wife during his absence,